On behalf of Mazdoor Kissan Party, I want to congratulate the organizers here for this successful event. Thank you very much. Ultra-leftism is the essence of the fractures in the socialist left today. Today, nowhere is the tendency towards ultra-leftism more amply on display than in the treatment of China and Russia as these states navigate through the post-Soviet era. The problem, however, does not only lie in the extremist black or white mischaracterization of China and Russia as imperialist states by some fellow socialists. We also note the clamoring for one-size-fits-all formulas that call for, among other things, an abstention from bourgeois parliaments and left fronts. Some organizations have formulated general theories for a range of other topics that are based on their narrow local experiences, which they want organizations from other countries to also blindly copy. Therefore, it is important to recognize that ultra-leftism is an attitude towards political issues in general. That is, it is a general tendency and not just some isolated occurrence of extreme positions on some specific international topics. The simple truth, no matter how frequently or loudly slogans and formulas are featured in literature or speeches, is that Marxist-Leninists in each country must pursue their own course instead of copying the experience of others. They must base their practical approach from the standpoint of the unique needs of their own movement, deriving it from a comprehensive assessment of the political economy, historical context, the specific characteristic of classes in the country, the prevailing mood around national matters, and particularly after assessing the strength of the revolutionary forces relative to the strength of the class opponents. That applies to decisions on what to do and when for all tactics, including the slogans to adopt, the necessary alliances that must be made, the attitude to adopt towards social or class groupings at a specific point in time, and what the strategy must be to progress to socialism. This is quite simply the application of materialist principles in practice. It is, as Karl Marx said, men make their own histories, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given, and transmitted from the past. Ultra-leftism leads to advocating political strategy and tactics that derive instead from idealistic utopias and unchangeable formulas. This manifests in the shape of total inflexibility on political action and socialist construction. Only a straight line, rapid advance constitutes success for ultra-leftists who abhor compromise and retreats. The inviolability of general principles and maximal demands are put above practical solutions. Yet, the history of revolution has proven that it does not proceed in a linear direction. It can advance or retreat, which requires the continuous adaptation of strategy, principles, and slogans. The end result of dogmatism within the socialist movement is that it leads to right-wing outcomes that the bourgeoisie finds convenient, that may retard the revolution or encourage revolutionaries to make dangerous mistakes. Inevitably, this tendency also transforms into sectarianism in the socialist movement. Far from furthering a working-class alternative to capitalism, this attitude towards political questions only plays into the hands of the bourgeoisie and contributes to the isolation of socialists. In addition, ultra-leftism was assuredly one of the leading factors that splintered the communist movement in the previous century. We must avoid repeating the same mistakes today.
That's right.
Therefore, while many hard or left-sounding or idealistic principles may be presented by some socialists, there is but one rule above all others, and that is the success of the revolution is the highest law, as Georgy Plekhanov once said. This means that the tactics and strategy for progressing to socialism have to be malleable, depending on the circumstances of the time, without being impeded by dogmatic doctrine. The great leaders who brought revolution to Russia and China would not have been successful had they not resisted ultra-leftism on the key questions of their day. Those critical questions at that time included, among others, when to participate in parliaments and when not to, when to declare truce against class enemies in war, the place of trade unions in a revolutionary state, whether an intermediate state capitalist stage was necessary for transitioning to socialism, whether socialism could be built in one country in the absence of a worldwide revolution in industrialized countries, the place of peasants in struggle, and indeed even the correct strategy in a revolutionary war of the people. In each of these cases, there was always an extreme view based on rigid dogmatism that amplified the risk of dashing both the revolutionaries and the movement on the rocks. We are in the same boat today. The present generation of socialists are thus obligated to resist ultra-leftist critiques of China and Russia and to oppose this tendency in all other topics that it permeates into. The consequences of not doing so are severe. We especially urge against taking an economic reductionist approach in assessing the historical development. It is more appropriate to objectively evaluate the path they have followed without the blanket denunciations that are typical in the manner of ultra-leftism. Thank you.
For your reference, the channel number 2 of your translation machine changed from English to French. The next speaker is Anti-imperialist Camp.